Barron Trump attacks Jasmine Crockett. She responds with truth, fire, and silence. The air didn't crackle. It waited. Inside the Gerald R. Ford Civic Center, hundreds sat silent not out of respect, but anticipation. Something was coming. Everyone knew it. The lights were too precise. The cameras too still. The silence wasn't absence. It was suspense coiled and humming, like the moment before a car crash. Or a confession. And then he walked in. 6'7", shoulders back, suit tailored within an inch of political destiny. Barron Trump wasn't here to blend in. He didn't need to. The name alone drew heat. The legacy walked before him like a shadow with its own security clearance. And tonight, he wasn't just a name, he was the moment. He approached the microphone the way his father had, 100 times deliberate, confident head, tilted with a smirk that said, "This won't take long." He looked out at the crowd, then down the panel, stopping at her. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She was seated third from the left, not slouched, not stiff, just still, like the kind of stillness that comes after burying things you can't unbury. She wore a navy blazer like armor, and an expression like a scalpel. She didn't reach for her mic. She didn't need to. He began. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice low rehearsed. "I've followed some of your legal history and your commentary, and frankly, it's hard to take people seriously when outrage is their career." It was a smile when he said it, not sarcasm, not malice. That kind of smile rich boys wear when the crowd is already with them, and they've never once needed a plan B. A half-beat pause, not a gasp, not a murmur, just that sacred moment in a room where no one dares blink, where the audience becomes witness and the floor starts to tremble under something you don't yet understand. Crockett still didn't move. She tilted her head slightly, not the tilt of confusion, but recognition. She'd heard this before. 1,000 times before, just never from someone so tall and so sure of so little. She didn't interrupt. She waited. Barron pushed on. "The thing is," he said now, looking at the crowd like they were allies in a private joke, "we can't fix anything if the loudest people in the room keep making it about themselves. I'm just saying being loud doesn't make you right." There it was, his closer, the smirk curled tighter at the edge. But Crockett, only then did she move. A breath. A pause. Then she leaned forward not to attack, but to begin. "Mr. Trump," she said evenly, her voice like courtroom velvet, "it's telling that those most bothered by my tone rarely have anything to say about the reasons I needed it." A ripple. The kind you feel in your teeth before your ears. But she wasn't done. "You call it outrage," she continued. "I call it survival." Now she turned not just to him, but to the room, to the country. Because what was coming wasn't personal. It was institutional. It was memory grief testimony, and it had a witness stand all its own. "I defended a 12-year-old in Dallas," once she said, voice, even eyes, steady. Suspended for talking back to a teacher. No one listened until the recording surfaced. The teacher had been mocking her dialect, her language. She wasn't being disrespectful. She was being black and female and brave. You could hear it then. The collective exhale of 100 people remembering every time they were told to calm down while being erased. She turned back to him. "And you," she said, "standing where you are, should be asking why so many people still need defending. Instead, you came here with a line, a smirk, and a team that thought this would make a great clip." Barron opened his mouth, a reflex, a defense mechanism, a script, but Crockett cut through him without raising her voice. "No," she said, "you're not just saying, you're performing. And unfortunately for you, I don't give standing ovations for weak scripts." He blinked, not in disbelief, in realization. The crowd didn't cheer. That would have been too cheap, too easy. What they did was sit very, very still, because something was happening, something that wasn't about partisanship or politics anymore. This wasn't about dunking or dominance. It was about what happens when someone walks into a room thinking the microphone makes them right, only to discover the mic just amplifies what's missing. Barron adjusted his jacket sleeve, a tick, a callback to his father. But it didn't land. The power in the room had shifted, and it hadn't asked his permission. Crockett leaned forward again, and for a moment it felt like the air itself leaned in to hear her. "Tone," she said softly. "Tone didn't get me through law school while working night shifts. Tone didn't help me sit with mothers who lost sons in traffic stops. And it sure as hell didn't keep me calm when a DA told a girl she was asking for it because she wore lip gloss to school." Barron sat back slightly, not retreating, not yet, but shaken. "I don't speak to impress," she said. "I speak to survive. And survive is something you've never had to learn, because the world gave you a microphone before it ever asked you a question. The room was no longer neutral, and he knew it. Barron Trump, son of a former president poster boy for Gen Z conservatism, was not the main character anymore. He was the student, the foil, the punchline in a story he didn't write. He reached for the mic again, paused, then lowered his hand. It was the first thing all night that wasn't rehearsed. The clip of that moment would go viral, not because of shouting, not because of spectacle, but because a woman sat still, told the truth, and let the weight of her story do the speaking. And a boy who thought the stage belonged to him suddenly didn't know his next line. He didn't know his next line. And that silence, brief, almost imperceptible, was louder than any rebuttal he could have mustered. Because the boy who arrived ready to command the room had just been reminded that there are spaces where a name can't protect you, and microphones don't bend for confidence alone. The moderator shifted awkwardly in his seat, sensing the power in the room had changed hands. The cue card in his hand trembled slightly, whether from nerves or reverence, no one could say. A producer off stage whispered something frantically into a headset, but none of it mattered, because everyone was still watching her. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't lean back with a smirk or even allow herself the dignity of a small nod. She simply folded her hands, let the silence breathe, and waited. It was Barron who moved first. Slowly, tentatively. He adjusted his mic, leaned in slightly, not to counter but to collect himself. And then, in a voice no longer buffered by entitlement, he said, "I didn't mean any disrespect." The words hung in the air like a peace offering from someone unsure how to surrender. But Crockett didn't rush to accept it. Instead, she asked the question no one was ready for. "Then, why did you rehearse it?" The room froze. Again. Not from offense, from recognition. Because everyone could see it. Now the shoulder shrugs, the sleeve adjustment, the line delivery. This wasn't a conversation. It was a performance designed to provoke a clip, not a response. Crockett continued, her voice still calm, still low. "You came here to make a point. I came here to listen. But when you confuse volume with vision, you walk into a room ready to be heard and end up proving how little you've seen." Barron sat upright. Not defensive, just uncertain. She turned to the audience, not to win them over, but to bring them in. "There's a game people like me have to play," she said. "It's called make them comfortable enough to believe you deserve the mic you're holding." But comfort never changed policy. It never protected a child from getting suspended because their voice cracked the wrong way. It never helped a mother explain to a school board why her daughter stopped speaking in class after a dress code violation got her labeled distracting. Cameras panned to the crowd. There were nods now, hands folding tighter in laps, brows furrowed not in confusion, but in memory. And then she dropped the weight. "When I was a public defender, I sat across from judges who told black girls they were too emotional after describing their own assaults. They didn't want tears. They wanted quiet. They wanted manners. They wanted tone." She looked back at Barron. "So, no, I don't adjust my voice to make you comfortable. I adjust it to make sure I'm heard before you decide I shouldn't be speaking at all." The shift was undeniable. Barron's posture softened. He wasn't leaning back in smug defiance anymore. He was leaning into the moment, trying to catch up. The moderator cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Crockett, we do have other," but she gently raised her hand, not to silence him, but to hold the floor. "Let me finish, because we always get cut off right before it gets real. That line, that line." The room inhaled as one. She let it sit. 1 second, 2, then continued. "Civility is a currency that people like me don't always get to spend. You ask for calm, but not for clarity. You ask for kindness, but never accountability. You want my tone to be measured, but you never measure the pain that shaped it." And now she was fully facing the crowd, not pleading, teaching. Outrage isn't a weakness, it's a tool. It's what we use when every polite attempt to be heard has been ignored, deflected, or punished. It's what's left when you filed every report, sent every letter, made every speech, and they still treat your story like background noise. Barron looked down. His hands were still. No mic tug, no smirk. Crockett finished the round with a final cut, not of flesh, but of ego. "You don't have to agree with me," she said. "But if you came here just to score a moment, then you're not ready for the movement." There was no applause, no dramatic music cue, just a long electric silence. The kind that doesn't end, it shifts. Somewhere backstage, a clip editor was already dragging a yellow timeline across a screen, clipping the moment when a Trump finally blinked, not because he lost, but because for the first time someone didn't flinch back. And the truth was, she never raised her voice. She just made it impossible to ignore. She didn't raise her voice. She just made it impossible to ignore. And that, more than the words, more than the stories, more than the legacy packed into every syllable, was what finally forced the room to listen. Barron didn't speak. Not yet. His jaw tightened slightly. Not in defiance, in discomfort. In that slow creeping recognition that maybe he hadn't walked into a battle. He'd walked into a lesson. One written in grief and carried in silence. The moderator, sensing a shift too profound to interrupt, gave a polite nod and gestured back to Barron. Would you like to respond, Mr. Trump? A pause. Then finally, I still think tone matters. Barron said slower now, softer, but maybe I'm starting to understand why it sounds different, depending on where you've come from. It wasn't a concession, it was a step. But Crockett didn't move to accept it or applaud it. She just blinked once, measured, exact. Then replied, You care about tone, she said, because you've never had to survive without content. The crowd didn't cheer, they absorbed. The words landed like the sound of a courtroom gavel, quiet, final, unarguable. But she wasn't finished. She leaned in not toward Barron but toward the center of the room, the camera, the country watching from couches in classrooms and Twitter timelines. Tone, she repeated, didn't help me explain to a mother that her son was found with a bruised ribcage and a note saying he fell in gym. Tone didn't stop a school from suspending a girl for wearing leggings during a lockdown drill, and it sure as hell didn't make me bite my tongue when a police chief said the phrase, he just didn't comply, as if that meant he deserved to die. Now her hands moved only slightly. One rested flat on the table. The other drew a line in the air, tracing invisible fractures in the silence between them. Tone is what people ask for when they don't want to deal with substance. It's the polite way of saying, make your pain sound more palatable. A woman in the back row let out a quiet, not sarcastic, not dismissive. Just one of those deep human sounds, the kind your body makes when truth walks in, uninvited. And then Crockett shifted. Not in posture, but in audience. Her words stopped being directed at Barron. They started speaking to the room, the viewers, the students watching behind laptop screens. We invite young voices into spaces like this, she said, but only if they're agreeable, only if they smile, nod, say, thank you for crumbs. But I didn't come here for crumbs. And I didn't come to be told how to sound while fighting for people who aren't even allowed in the room. Now she turned back to Barron. You want to challenge power good. That's what you should be doing. But if you're coming with pre-scripted punches hoping I'll flinch for your highlight reel, then you brought the wrong energy to the wrong table. She let that line sit. Let the silence wrap around it like a verdict. Barron tried to interject, the instinct automatic. I just meant that, but she lifted a hand, not to silence him, to protect the moment from being diluted. No, she said firmly without malice. You meant to provoke me, and I want you to think real hard about why that was your strategy in the first place. She held his eyes now, not in aggression, but in gravity. Because I've buried friends because of systems you've only read about. You've been featured in magazines for being tall. There it was. Not a punchline, not a dunk, just wait. And you could feel it shift the room again. Not a single phone buzzed, not a single camera operator dared pan away. The lens stayed fixed on her, because this was no longer a debate. It was an intervention. Crockett's voice dropped a note lower, not in anger, but intimacy. You came here ready to lead, she said. Then tell me what you're willing to lose votes for. Tell me what you'd risk your career for. And if your answer is nothing, then you're not ready. That sentence was not spoken, it was etched. Even the moderator seemed thrown. He shuffled his cards with trembling fingers, lips parted, as if to speak, but no words followed. Then, almost like an aftershock, Crockett softened just slightly. I'm not here to embarrass you, she said, eyes gentler now. But don't ask for the mic if you haven't thought about what it's supposed to carry. And don't mistake calm for weakness. Because silence, she paused. Silence has carried more grief than most speeches ever will. Barron swallowed, this time visibly. He didn't have a retort. He didn't even reach for one. His fingers twitched once over the mic, then fell still. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to understand. And somewhere behind him, a young man, the student organizer from Fresno, the one who'd tried to warn him earlier, just nodded once. Not smugly, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet kind of respect. The kind you offer when someone finally sits down, not out of defeat, but out of realization. And Jasmine. She folded her hands, didn't speak again. Because nothing needed to be added. The lesson had landed. He sat with it. Not because she asked him to, not because the cameras demanded it, but because for the first time in that entire auditorium, the silence didn't feel like an opportunity. It felt like a responsibility. Barron Trump, raised behind velvet ropes and presidential glass, had never been asked to sit in the weight of someone else's truth without interrupting. But now Jasmine Crockett had done what no pundit, no teacher, no staged opposition had managed before. She made him stop. And what happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was something far rarer. He didn't reach for the mic. He didn't perform. He looked at her, not with smirk, not with smug calculation, but with something closer to recognition. The silence stretched. The moderator gave them both space, unsure if what was happening was technically on schedule, but knowing instinctively that cutting away would have been a mistake. And then finally, Barron leaned forward, barely audible over the weight in the room. "I think I see your point," he said. His voice didn't tremble, but it carried none of the steel from earlier, only the soft weight of a young man realizing he'd walked into a fire with a matchstick and thought it made him fireproof. Crockett didn't answer. Not immediately. Her body was still composed, but her eyes held him there. She wasn't pressing for submission. She was watching to see if this was real or just retreat disguised as reflection. And then, just when the moment seemed to ease, she spoke again. Not sharply, just clearly. "You don't have to agree with me," she said. "But if you're going to be here, really here, then bring something real, not rehearsed, not passed down, real." That word real hung in the rafters like smoke. Even those who had walked in rooting for him, who had hoped to see Crockett stumble or get rattled or owned, began to shift in their seats. Because there was no viral moment here, no meme, no knockout line, just a woman sitting across from a boy who had power but no experience. And instead of humiliating him, she held up a mirror. And he looked. The moderator, perhaps trying to restore structure, gestured toward the next card. "Let's move to the issue of digital privacy." But the words fell flat. Because no one, not the audience, not the staff, not even the other panelists, was ready to move on. Not yet. Not from that. Crockett gave a small nod. Not of dismissal. Just permission. And then quietly, she turned her gaze back to the room. Because what needed to happen next wasn't about Barron anymore. It was about them. She leaned into her mic, not louder, not fiercer, just firmer. "I wasn't always in Congress," she said. "I wasn't born with a platform. I didn't grow up thinking anyone would care what I had to say. I spent 12 years representing people the system had already decided were disposable." Now the energy shifted again, not as a battle, as testimony. She told them about Marcus Bellamy, a quiet boy, 8th grade, wrong place, wrong time. A school officer grabbed his backpack. Marcus pulled back not to fight, but to protect. Inside the backpack's a notebook, drawings, anime, a doodle of Sonic the Hedgehog. That image, a teenage black boy criminalized for protecting a cartoon fox, landed harder than any statistic could. He was charged, she said, suspended, labeled, processed. At 13, a pause. His mother worked 2 jobs, slept in her car during trial week. "You want to talk about outrage?" She looked up. "I'd love to see you whisper your way through that." Nobody interrupted her, not the moderator, not Barron, not the producers sitting behind the booth who were now watching the runtime tick past schedule but couldn't look away. Because this was no longer a political forum, this was something else. She sat back slightly, eyes scanning the students, the interns, the camera operators, the people who lived closer to Marcus than to any senator. "There's this narrative," she said, "that black women in politics are too loud, too emotional, too direct, that we're a problem to be managed, a tone to be softened, a fire to be dimmed." She turned just enough to face Barron again, not to confront him, but to anchor the moment. "You thought if you provoked me, I'd prove your point, that I'd raise my voice. Flare, break. But what you didn't count on, what your team didn't prepare you for, is how much discipline it takes to hold fire and the room at the same time." Barron didn't flinch, but his silence now carried a different weight, not hesitation, humility. You could feel the audience recalibrating, not because they switched sides, but because they'd witnessed something rare, a confrontation that didn't destroy but revealed. And then she delivered the line that would echo across classrooms, TikTok, congressional staff, Slack channels for weeks. "You brought a water pistol to a forest fire," she said, not mocking, just stating. And the forest wasn't her. It was everything she carried, the clients, the trials, the women and girls who weren't told they were too much until their silence got them buried, the people who never got a microphone, never got a second chance. She was their echo, and in that moment, she didn't need applause. She just needed the room to remember. And it did. The room remembered, not because she demanded it, not because she raised her voice or pointed a finger, but because she left no other option. When Crockett finished, the silence didn't just linger, it settled, like dust from a building that had been cracked open not by force but by truth. She sat back, no triumphant lean, no look of conquest, just presence. And across from her, Barron Trump no longer looked like someone trying to win a debate. He looked like someone trying to understand what had just happened. He wasn't slouched. He wasn't scowling. He was still upright, but the sharp edges were gone. The boy who had walked in with practiced barbs and a camera-ready smirk was now just a young man holding the weight of what he'd never lived. Crockett didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The echo was doing the work for her. You could see it in the way the audience shifted. Some leaned forward like they didn't want to miss what came next. Others stared down at their hands processing, and a few, especially the youngest, looked at her like a blueprint had just unfolded in front of them. For a long moment, no one said anything. Even the moderator had gone still, his script forgotten, his cue cards limp in hand. And that was when Barron almost quietly reached for the mic again. "I didn't come here to disrespect you," he said, voice low, "but I think I came here to sound smart. Maybe I should have come here to ask better questions." It wasn't a statement, it was a reckoning. A few eyebrows lifted in the crowd, not in ridicule, but recognition. Because it was rare, so rare to see someone that protected that, positioned to admit even a sliver of misstep, especially live, especially here. Crockett gave a small nod. Not a celebration, a signal. That moment, the space between confrontation and comprehension, is where growth begins. And Jasmine knew that, so she leaned in again. Gently. "Take that and grow," she said. Because the mic doesn't make you right, but listening might. It wasn't a mic drop. It was something heavier, a truth that didn't need punctuation. And then the moderator voice hushed, like he'd just walked out of a church service, gently pivoted. "We'll now move to closing statements, unless the panel has more to add." He looked around. No one spoke. What could they add? The segment officially ended 3 minutes later. But for most people watching online at home, in classrooms, on subways, that moment between them was the ending. And it didn't end with victory, it ended with reflection. And that's what made it powerful, because while the panelists wrapped up their thoughts and the credits began to roll on the C-SPAN stream, something else was already in motion. The clips, the edits, the uploads, 15 seconds of Crockett saying, "The mic doesn't make you right." A longer cut, showing Barron blinking, his face softening in real time, as Crockett told the story of Marcus and the Sonic the Hedgehog sketchbook. The exchange where she said, "You confuse volume with vision," repeated with subtitles on TikTok. And this time, the internet didn't treat it like just another gotcha moment. It treated it like a lesson. By midnight, high school civics teachers were emailing the clip to their departments. Debate coaches were assigning it to varsity squads. Students were dissecting the moment frame by frame, not to roast it, but to learn from it. And perhaps the most unexpected part, so was Barron. He didn't hide. He didn't lash out. He didn't release a half-baked rebuttal blaming media bias. Instead, just before 1 a.m., from what looks like a quiet room with poor lighting, he recorded a short video on his phone. No edits, no overlays, just his face. "Last night, I tried to make a point," he said, "but I got taught a better one. You don't have to agree with someone to learn from them, and I learned something. That was it. No theatrics, just a camera and a change." Crockett didn't repost it, didn't quote tweet, didn't dunk. But her office did issue a single quiet statement the next morning. "Public spaces work best when people enter them ready to listen. That includes all of us." Last night was a reminder of what that can look like. And in the background, behind the press buzz and social clips, something more honest was unfolding. Their teams were already talking. Not about follow-up interviews, not about national tours, about a youth-led roundtable in Dallas, about bringing more young people into policy-making spaces, about teaching how to challenge with substance, not just sound bites. And that was the real legacy of the night, because most viral moments burn hot and die fast. But this one stayed warm. It lingered. It didn't make either of them a saint. It didn't turn Crockett into a savior or Barron into a villain. It did something more rare. It changed both of them, and the internet noticed. It changed both of them. And maybe that was the most radical part of all, because in a political landscape, addicted to takedowns, to trending rage, to clip-size humiliation, delivered like sport, this story refused to end with a winner and a loser. It ended with two people sitting in the same silence and walking out of it. Different. By sunrise, the footage had spread far beyond political circles. Not just the sharp lines, not just Crockett's scalpel phrases or Barron's blink of reckoning. It was the space between those things. The way she paused before she spoke. The way he lowered his eyes without fleeing. The way neither of them treated the moment like a performance, even though they were both on camera. In a Brooklyn high school, a government teacher stopped mid-lesson and pulled up the clip. In a Kansas City newsroom, an editor pushed back an entire morning segment because the replay of the exchange kept prompting debate among the staff. In a Los Angeles coffee shop, a college student opened TikTok to watch a 15-second slice and didn't scroll past. She rewatched it, twice, because it felt like something we don't see anymore. Not just honesty, not just conflict, but real-time growth. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk out of that auditorium with applause thundering behind her. She didn't pose backstage for viral selfies or tweet a victory lap. She didn't need to, because her power didn't come from winning. It came from not flinching when someone tried to flatten her story into a caricature. It came from staying grounded in years of cases, clients' names, and blood, while someone else tried to treat her work like a rhetorical exercise. And Barron, he left the stage quieter than he arrived. That was the point. He didn't look humiliated. He looked new. Unsettled, yes, but grounded in a way that was unfamiliar to him. Because sometimes what we need isn't a comeback. Sometimes what we need is a crack, a fracture in the mirror we've been holding up to the world, a moment that lets something else in. And what Crockett did that night in front of the lights and live streams and expectations wasn't just political. It was instructional. She didn't humiliate him. She didn't demolish him. She educated him, but without calling it that, without lecturing, without branding herself the moral superior. She simply refused to shrink, refused to sweeten the truth, and let the full weight of her lived experience stand beside the full reach of his inherited power. And it turned out, truth told quietly still echoes. A week later, a policy class at Howard University used the clip for their ethics seminar. 3 days after that, a conservative podcast with 500,000 subscribers played Barron's follow-up video without mocking it. Even they had to admit something had shifted. "This isn't what we expected from him," one host said. "I thought he'd double down. Instead, he listened." And that, in a way, was Jasmine Crockett's greatest victory. Not that she silenced someone, but that she created a space where someone with a platform chose to listen in public. Because that's rare. Rare to see someone powerful not perform. Rare to see someone marginalized not be erased. Rare to see both things happen in the same moment and neither side weaponize it. By the end of that week, memes had come and gone. But one phrase remained. On student-made posters, on slides and teacher PowerPoints, in captions under Instagram Reels. You care about tone because you never had to survive without content. No slogan, no branding. Just a sentence that landed in the middle of a country too tired of shouting and too afraid of quiet. And in the quiet that followed, something grew. A reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary thing we can do is listen when it would be easier to fight. Crockett didn't rewrite history that night. Barron didn't undo the weight of privilege with one nod. But together, however briefly, they cracked something open. They showed us a model of what it looks like to be changed by the room, not just to try and control it, of what leadership might sound like when it stops performing, and what courage might look like when it stops needing applause. Because the truth is, microphones don't just amplify volume, they amplify who you are when the script runs out. And on that night in that auditorium, when everything else fell away, what remained wasn't power, it was presence. And presence, when rooted in truth, doesn't fade. It lingers, it teaches, it waits. For the next voice brave enough to speak without permission, and the next listener brave enough to hear what makes them uncomfortable. Because change doesn't always arrive with fire. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper, and this time the whole country heard it.